Despite all the effort to get an Alien sequel going, no one knew if Sigourney Weaver was even interested in being in it. Which she wasn't. Ghostbusters had rebounded her film career, her theater work was going very well, and at the moment she was shooting a French film with Gerard Depardieu. Fox wasn't happy with what it was sure would be the salary demands of the actress who'd now become a star, and Cameron was told to replace Ripley with a male lead. He refused, making clear they were willing to walk away without Ripley. This wasn't some popcorn film he'd sweated over. There was a psychological and emotional aspect to it that you'd gut if you tried that. Weaver hadn't wanted to do it, suspecting a sequel would be a vacuous cash grab, but Cameron's passionate insistence on the role of Ripley convinced her to at least give the script a read. She was pleased that there was so much more to Ripley this time, not just her inner life either, but a bond with that little girl. On the strength of this and the willingness of a young director willing to walk away purely for artistic integrity, Weaver agreed to discuss things. However, she and Cameron did clash about some of the aspects. Use of guns was one thing. Hating the alien was another. There were some things that Cameron was willing to acquiesce to, but the idea that Ripley wouldn't despise the creatures that slaughtered her crew, destroyed her career, and stole her life, he couldn't accept that. It was tenuous, but Fox disliked having to deal with a star who had so much leverage. There was so much feet-dragging going on, so finally Cameron decided to play upon Hollywood paranoia. He called up Schwarzenegger's agent, talking about his career at the moment and mentioning that, you know what, maybe everyone was right, doing a sequel is a mistake. After you've made a completely original hit, you need to go on to bigger and better things. I'll make this movie my own by cutting Ripley out of it. Cameron knew that Schwarzenegger and Weaver were both represented by the same firm, and that word would quickly go through the agency that a lucrative deal was about to go up in smoke. Well, finally, Weaver was a lock on the film, with a $1 million salary, so high it put her in the same league as Elizabeth Taylor and Barbra Streisand. So they had their star. However, it was hardly the last obstacle that they would have to deal with. Having come up under Roger Corman's "we'll take any mammal with a head" approach to crewing films, it allowed for a sort of gladiatorial arena of filmmaking in some ways. Those with the ability to do a job well and under extreme pressure were noticed, and allowed for a unique networking of similar creatives. So James Cameron and Gale Hurd both had people they could reliably call upon for making their movies that the larger studios like Fox had never heard of. Even Hurd had to submit to an interview to produce. They were keeping costs down this way, but Fox wanted to go a step further and return to England to shoot the film. If you thought there'd been cultural clash among the actors on the original film, it had nothing on the sequel and the crew. These were the cinematic equivalent of people who fought lions for a living on one side, and on the other, Brits with enormous respect for Ridley Scott. There was a sense that his involvement and his crew had made Alien a great British picture, and the presence of all these Americans insisting the sequel have all these American things in it was infuriating to some. They felt that many of the roles being filled by the American crew were ones that should have been filled by local creatives instead, especially not people who'd worked on Corman schlock. It's kind of ironic that the film that had brought all of these foreigners in to interfere with the British was called Aliens. On the American side, the union rules and filmmaking attitude was irritating. Everything would be set up for a shot, then the doors would roll open and the lady with the tea cart would come in, and the whole crew would just leave whatever they were doing, letting all the carefully prepared smoke billow out. Cameron would respond to these interruptions by forming an impromptu second unit and shooting video footage for the helmet cams. The opinion among the Americans was that making this film was going off to war, while their British colleagues thought it was a party. More infuriating was that Hurd and Cameron had been recently married. The British presumed that Gale Hurd wasn't really the producer. She was just the director's wife and had been given a title and a salary, but someone else was actually doing all of the work. They were resistant to the idea of a woman producer on the film. The production manager would go behind her back until the point that he was fired off the film. Tim Hampton at Fox was getting calls and having to insist he was not the producer. Talk to Heard. There was also a different craft sensibility. One of the oddest facts about transatlantic filmmaking I've found is how often American directors and British cinematographers have clashed. Disagreement between the two about who gets the final word on things such as lighting and framing. Directors I have encountered having this problem: George Lucas, John Milius, and now James Cameron. To quote a great British artist, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. These men were fully versed in exactly how cinematography works. George Lucas wrote technical articles on how the cameras work. Yet at the time, the British film culture was intolerant of any interference in their craft, unwilling to consider any innovative approaches of the director. Cameron, it should be noted, had mastered so many aspects of filmmaking, it was observed that if he could be cloned, one man could make the entire movie if you just gave him actors. His perfectionism in understanding the technology of filmmaking to the degree that he did led to a clash with cinematographer Dick Bush. "Let the director direct," he said dismissively. When he was shown the shooting schedule and said, "We can't make this," David Giler confirmed that Heard should definitely fire Bush and replace him. There were times when it seemed that Cameron was on the edge of firing his entire British crew, and that said crew might just walk off the set. Irvin Kershner, who had directed The Empire Strikes Back here, remember, observed the British crew around this time seemed to take the firing as a cultural attack. It was making life difficult for all the American filmmakers. And that wasn't the only cultural clash on Aliens. Casting also presented a cultural problem. The Vietnam aspect colored the view of the Marines. They needed to seem like American grunts comfortable with hardware. No British accents. Though some could pull convincing American accents, and Canadians in the UK also were convincing. Very convincing. For one thing, the British crew kept referring to Cameron as Grizzly Adams, and that he was a stereotypical American. While he could fairly be called an American director, in the sense that he had come up in the American film industry, he actually wasn't American, but Canadian. But finding American actors living in the UK wasn't going great either, because it was felt by casting too many had gone native. They'd lacked the capacity to convey the shit-kicker attitude that Heard and Cameron were looking for. Al Matthews, though, was all they could have hoped for Sergeant Apone. The actor was actually far more known in the UK for his role in the folk music scene, and yet he was a former Marine sergeant. He not only worked well bringing the small role to life, but his experience and personality made it easy for people to respond in character. When part of a set collapsed on William Hope, who was cast to play Lieutenant Gorman, Matthews leapt in, barking orders to the other actors to quickly resolve it before it became serious. Matthews also ensured everyone was taught about gun safety, and he made it stick. Never point it at anyone, and keep your damn finger off the trigger. Not everything was a prop. Some had to be working weapons. The pulse rifle was a Thompson submachine gun with a pump-action shotgun shortened and mounted underneath. But some were indeed made to work. Hick's shotgun was also real, to fire blanks, though somehow live rounds wound up on set. They wound up in the shotgun of James Remar, who had been recommended by Walter Hill from his work on Warriors to play the role of Corporal Hicks, the sole Marine survivor of the film. Ironically, he was fired early in the production. At the time, it was claimed he'd asked to leave with personal matters at home, but in reality he had a drug problem and got busted by the cops. No word on whether or not his drug problem was related to what happened on set, but Remar, who hadn't much taken the lessons to heart and who wandered away from the set, accidentally fired the shotgun loaded with live rounds. Thankfully, no one was hurt, though he did blow a hole in the set where Frank Oz was trying to shoot Little Shop of Horrors. On the opposite end was Mark Ralston, in his screen debut as Vasquez's close squad mate, Drake. He had trouble firing his flamethrower as he was directed because Cameron wanted it aimed in the direction of the crew, far enough away and behind protective plexiglass to be safe, but the training had made very clear to never ever point the weapon at people, never mind fire at them, with something genuinely dangerous. But not to worry, Heard was meticulous about safety on the film. She even said they should have the cameras recording the arriving APC remotely operated. A fortunate precaution, because the brakes failed and the APC destroyed the cameras. Still, they had to go through thousands of applicants before they'd be allowed to bring in American actors for these roles. They were able to bring back Bill Paxton and Lance Henriksen from The Terminator to play the Marine Hudson and the android Bishop. But the search for Newt was hard. They needed a little girl who could act, except all the child actors had done commercials, and so had been trained to smile after every line. Not appropriate for a psychologically scarred survivor. Carrie Henn, daughter of an American military father and British mother, who had never acted, did an audition with Weaver herself to try out the chemistry, and it worked. They'd found their Newt. For Vasquez, they auditioned Jeanette Goldstein, several times actually, including inexplicably having her read as Hudson, despite there being no intention for Hudson to be female. It was after casting that it was explained. Hudson is voicing everything Vasquez is thinking, but is too proud to actually say aloud. It helped to give a view of Vasquez's inner life. Paul Reiser, a comedian, had stumbled into acting when he'd gone through the wrong door by mistake and was found to be perfect for a role in 1982's Diner. Cameron had no idea he was actually a stand-up, but was impressed at how he could give Burke this slickness that laid alongside an otherwise affable personality, only letting the smallest image of what he was capable of to be seen. He expressed bemused frustration at the glamour of all the Marine costumes. They got to customize their armor to fit their characters' personalities, and all Reiser got was a flannel shirt with a padded vest over it. To add insult to injury, more than once someone would yell at him to get out of the frame because, with everyone dressed for the freezing cold shoot, he looked like he was a member of the film crew. He asked Cameron for a file of facts to carry around so he'd have some kind of a prop at least, but Cameron pointed out, "If I give it to you, you're going to have to carry it around for the next 3 months, even if you grow to dislike it." Michael Biehn, who as mentioned worked with Cameron on The Terminator and was disappointed not to be in Aliens, was asked to be the replacement for Hicks on a moment's notice. He inherited the armor, which didn't quite fit right, and also had a red heart painted over the actual heart, something he found absurd. Why give an enemy a bright target to aim at? He was a little uncomfortable playing a character who seemed similar to Kyle Reese, so Cameron directed him to play the character as the squad's Rock of Gibraltar and the guy next door, rather than the more feral Reese. The only serious problem was a special effect had been done with Remar in the shot. Now the set was struck and the miniature used had been destroyed. It required careful manipulation to salvage the footage without having the wrong Hicks in the picture. Fortunately, they had a solid list of people to help out with effects. In keeping with their reliable people, low-budget approach, Cameron and Hurd decided to pass on ILM and their major competitor, Boss, for those that they had found reliable. Most obvious was Stan Winston, who had pulled off the impressive robotics in The Terminator and who gelled well with Cameron's perfectionism and understanding of visual effects. Winston would be responsible for bringing the alien queen and the practical adult aliens to life. The Skoutak brothers, Dennis and Robert, had been colleagues of Cameron and Hurd on Corman movies, most appropriately the alien knockoff Galaxy of Terror. They were partial owners of the LAFX group now and working on Creature at this time, but were quickly intrigued. What was especially beneficial for Cameron with Winston and the Skoutak brothers was being able to have much of the effects happening during filming and looking convincing. Cameron and Gale had a preliminary meeting in England with the Skoutaks, who brought their wives to turn it into a little vacation. Dennis' wife even pitched in a little in an unofficial capacity. She was rather experienced in the genre, in fact. Dennis Skoutak was married to DC Fontana, most famous for her work on Star Trek. In England, John Richardson, who oversaw practical effects on 3 James Bond films as well as Superman, would be in charge of handling the practical effects for the battles between the Marines and the aliens. He brought in Julian Perry, who specialized in miniatures and who quickly got started on the models for the colony structure and vehicles. He'd been hoping to run this, actually, but found out he and his people were going to be folded into the work being handled by LAFX. But the results spoke for themselves. Footage was sent back to Fox, who were initially upset with what they saw. "Where are the special effects?" they demanded. "You're looking at them. Hurd answered. That's not a set. Those are models. The Alien Terminator approach of a gritty, grimy reality helped pull off the magician's trick that they were hoping for. You didn't even realize you were looking at special effects when you saw them. Now they were working on a big budget, for them, picture. Hurd and Cameron could afford a luxury they hadn't had on Terminator: concept artists. H.R. Giger wasn't approached, to his immense disappointment after the fact, though this was because he was already contractually obligated to do Poltergeist 2, so they knew he wasn't going to be available. Ron Cobb was available, though, bringing his NASA sense to design and providing a consistency with the human technology seen in the first film. They also wanted Sid Mead, who'd worked with Ridley Scott on Blade Runner, but was nowhere to be found. He turned up in Florida, judging the Miss USA pageant. The division of labor was Mead on the military and futuristic elements, Cobb on civilian technology, and Cameron himself extrapolated from Giger's work to do the alien concepts. Another bit of continuity was that some of the actual sets and models were still around, but in private hands. Bob Burns was famous for pulling off these elaborate Halloween parties, and in 1979 had done Alien. The extra buzz was appreciated by Fox, who were impressed with what he'd done. And since they didn't have plans for it anyway, they gave some of those items to Burns. He was happy to loan them out to the production, though they were in rough shape and needed major restoration. But that continuity for Ripley's shuttle was appreciated. They'd even added the tiny detail that the grappling gun she'd used to knock the alien through the door was still wedged at the base of the door when she was rescued. What had changed were the aliens themselves. The intention had been to be identical to the originals. They actually had most of Giger's original molds to work with. But when it came time to put the smooth covering over the heads, Cameron said not to. The textured surface underneath would photograph better and made it more visually interesting. Since there was going to be multiple aliens on screen, it wasn't necessary to cast a giant again, so Cameron went for two types of players in the suits: stuntmen experienced with acrobatics and dancers. The former could move about in a way that a human normally wouldn't, hanging from walls and ceilings, climbing about. The latter would have experience in precision body movement, to have the alien move in meticulously choreographed ways that seemed inhuman. For the Alien Queen, Cameron proposed to Stan Winston a variant on Ridley Scott's repeated thoughts of strapping children onto people. Let's have two stuntmen side by side inside of the animatronic puppet. They managed to save money on the APC. Rather than the original plan of building a working one from scratch, they discovered that Heathrow Airport was looking to replace two of its 12-cylinder tractors that were used to tow around jumbo jets. They managed to acquire one of the obsolete ones for only £2,000, with only one downside. It weighed 72 tons. That's approximately the same weight as an Abrams tank. They managed to strip enough off to get it down to a more reasonable 28 tons, though there was still care required, as established with the failed brakes mentioned earlier. Another cost-saving advantage, compared to the Terminator especially, was that almost no location work was needed. The only exception was the atmospheric processor, to be shot at a coal plant that had been shut down in 1983, except the location did have a problem: asbestos. They had to pay to have it removed, thoroughly cleaned, and then tested to verify it met minimum standards in order to film there. Amusingly, these standards were so strict that when it was done, it was more healthy to work in that studio than at Pinewood. The atmosphere at Pinewood certainly wasn't healthy at this time. The cultural tension finally boiled over, and the focal point of that was Derek Cracknell, the first assistant director. He was a long-time presence in British film, and the crew were loyal to him, but he was set in his ways. He annoyed the American actors, repeatedly calling Goldstein "love," which pulled her out of her character, as it was an address that no one would ever give to Vasquez. He also made the mistake of physically stopping Lance Henriksen, pushing on his chest. Henriksen, as a self-described New Yorker, said, "Touch me again, and I'll kick your ass." Cracknell would also sarcastically refer to Cameron as "governor." The real cultural sticking point was that the British approach was, you pay your dues, you do the time, and advance through experience. James Cameron hadn't done that. This fuzz-faced punk was 31 years old and thought he knew everything. Cameron came from the film school of hard knocks, and when you come up that way, you actually need to know how to do everything. These people with their damn tea breaks and becoming useless after lunch because they'd had some pints down at the pub, they'd never had to actually work to get a film done. The opinion going around was that Cracknell should be directed, and no one believed it more than Cracknell himself. Cameron's opinion was these people were privileged and thought they didn't need to listen. The infuriating thing was that Cracknell would be told how they were doing a setup and would do it instead in his way, as if he was going to prove something, while to Cameron all it proved was that he didn't know how to make the kind of picture they were making. Terry Ackland Snow, who was British but in the art department, said everyone knew that first assistants, they're really just frustrated directors. Finally, Hurd and Cameron told Cracknell it was time to go. Cracknell responded by going around to the British crews and organized a walk-off. It was Sigourney Weaver who finally stepped in as the person everyone had to listen to and organized a meeting to clear the air and to make the positions clear. Cracknell had to be rehired, the Brits insisted. There was no room for argument there. Cameron made clear he was tired of the passive-aggressive resistance from the Brits. He was fine with getting a new crew. They laughed. He was serious. He said he felt they were intent on sabotaging this picture so they could say later that it was inept American filmmakers that were to blame. That wasn't just exaggeration or paranoia. While the Alien Queen's egg sack was being cast, someone threw some big plaster molds on top of it that nearly destroyed it. No one knows who, or even if it was a different film crew that just was upset with them. But it was a symbol of what Cameron felt was the problem, undermining the film that would make or break his career, and purely out of spite. The Fox financial people arrived, and Mark Rolston commented to Paul Reiser, "Uh-oh, the mafia is here." They were shockingly intimidating. The British crew painted it afterwards as Cameron played a game of chicken and had to blink, but the reality was more of a compromise. Cameron had turned a $6.4 million movie into a $78 million global hit. Fox was thrilled with the footage they were getting. If Cameron insisted to them that there was intentional sabotage on their likely mega hit, that replacing the crew was the only way to protect their investment, they were unlikely to be inclined to be skeptical. The most likely answer of what happened in that meeting is that Sigourney Weaver had the power to kill this film, and got Cracknell and his supporters to accept this was James Cameron's film and they needed to give it and him their enthusiastic support. And that Cameron had to respect that this wasn't a guerrilla film unit and these people had aspects to their film industry and culture that he had to respect. The end result was a bit like a fault line. Pressure was slowly building up underneath until finally the earthquake had happened. But now that it had, there was a new landscape. Cameron and Cracknell resolved to work better together after that, and the British crew started becoming more accepting of their American colleagues, like the Skoutak brothers, whom they had to admit did know what they were doing. Stan Winston arranged a big party to get the effects teams together for a big social event in Bond. It had been a rough journey, but they managed to finally bring them together as one crew to try to see this film through to completion. There were, of course, still other problems arising, but the kind that inevitably happen, such as the aforementioned set collapse inside of the APC. Cameron was actually injured in that as well. Another incident was that a mistake was made in the materials for some of the set. When the inside of the APC was on fire from Drake's flamethrower, it was filling with smoke, and Vasquez cried out, "I can't breathe in this!" Bill Paxton thought to himself, "Wow, that's a great ad-lib," and then realized he couldn't breathe in that either. Aliens was full of plenty of improvs and on-the-day ideas. Goldstein accused Al Matthews of stealing her light while they were coming out of the pods. He said he'd do her one better and steal the camera from her too. Then on the next take, he pulled out a cigar and stuck it in his mouth, and as predicted, Camera whipped the camera around to capture it. For her part, Goldstein had been working out ever since she'd started auditioning. I was self-conscious about how her ample bust looked in the tank tops they wore, especially with Hudson's remark about her being mistaken for a man. It was ludicrous. What kind of man was hauling these two things around? So she asked if maybe the context for it could be that she was doing these pull-ups, so that it was the Vasquez's hardness that might provoke a masculine context. Cameron loved the idea and had them rig something up so she could do pull-ups, even ones behind the neck. Everyone agreed that Weaver's presence on the set was fantastic, that despite the seriousness of the character she plays, she's lighthearted and fun. Aside of having missed out on the Marine bonding, she arrived on day 16 of the shoot, she got on well with everyone. Her only personal issue came with the guns. Essentially, she hated that she liked it. That's not a contradiction. Her feeling was that guns were morally wrong, and the fact they're fun makes it awful. Think of it like being devoted to your spouse, even as you're being tempted to have an affair. She accepted that Ripley would take up arms, but only to protect Newt. She had been helpless to save 5 of her shipmates from the alien. She will not allow anything, even her own trepidations, stop her from protecting this child. Weaver wasn't a fan of being an action star, but it being in the context of maternal, of protecting, of being a shield and not a sword. That she was fine with, as were her peers. She received something almost unheard of, an Oscar nomination for Best Female Lead for a science fiction film. By the time the film was finished, all animosity had faded. Cameron gave a farewell speech to the British crew, which included, "This has been a long and difficult shoot, fraught by many problems. But the one thing that kept me going through it all was the certain knowledge that one day I would drive out the gate of Pinewood and never come back, and you sorry bastards would still be stuck here." The Brits took it as the highest compliment. After all the troubles, Aliens succeeded at what Cameron and Hurd wanted it to be, a film that didn't feel like it had a 2 in the title. It added to the cultural zeitgeist. Bug hunt. Game over, man, game over. Nuke it from orbit, it's the only way to be sure. And most memorably of the mama bear that Ripley was, get away from her, you bitch. Heinlein might have created the Space Marines, but it was Aliens that defined them for popular culture. From the director told not to mention he did Piranha 2, to being told your sequel set the gold standard, it was vindication. Alien and Aliens coexisted just fine. Like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the story can continue without repeating or diminishing what came before.